بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين صلى الله على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. In this session I'd like to discuss a point that I briefly mentioned in the first session, which is why we are not going to use the two common methods in approaching discussions related to the understanding of the Quran, which I'm not going to call tafsir. But as soon as we talk about understanding the Quran, the first discipline that comes to mind is tafsir. We're not trying to go through a discipline of tafsir. That's not what these sessions are about. We're trying to understand the Quran. The two methods that are common in tafsir, one is tafsir tartibi, to go by the order of the verses in a chapter. And sometimes that means if it's an entire or if it's a complete tafsir of the entirety of the Quran, that means from the beginning to the end, you go based on that particular order. The other method that is common somewhat, not as much as tartibi, is some translated as thematic. So you choose a theme and then you go over the verses of the Quran that you think are relevant to that theme. We're not going to use either of those in these sessions, each for a reason. The main reason for both of them, the common reason for both of them, is one of the biggest pitfalls of misunderstanding the Quran is to follow or to understand the Quran based on preconceived notions. When we go to the Quran to understand, we should not have any preconceived notions of pretty much anything. Besides the Arabic language, we need to go with a clean slate. No prejudgments of any sort. One of the prejudgments, for example, that I've seen some of the mufassirin have when they use the tartibi tafsir, which is to go by the order of the verses, is that they tend to, and they've explicitly said this, that they assume that a chapter has one theme or a couple of subjects that they think they find at the beginning of the chapter and at the end of the chapter, and they want to make everything relevant to those subjects. When you enter a chapter based on that thought process, and I'll say what I think may be the reason for that thought process is, but when you do so, assuming that without deriving it from the verses, your mind is going to be looking for things, and when it finds what it thinks it has found, what it was looking for, then it automatically jumps to, oh, this is what I'm looking for, this is it. And so things that are not very clear, but because the mind has already assumed there is such a thing, you're looking for that thing, you see a couple of signs and you pick it up and you say, okay, this is what it is. One of the other things that happens with, for example, the thematic tafsir of the Quran is that you're looking for the answer to a particular question. And that's a good thing to do. Having questions, going to the Quran to understand those questions or find answers for those questions is a great thing to do. But one of the things that comes from the Quran, for example, the clear verse says, but the one that I'm referring to right now, specifically, فَقْرَؤُوا مَا تَيَسَّرَ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ. Read the Quran. Sometimes you go with a question to find an answer, and we need to do that. But when we're having a public session and we're trying to sit down and understand the Quran, One of the things that should be available, again, we're not suggesting that those two other methods should be avoided. Even the tartibi that we said, there's a pitfall there, there's certain assumptions that could be made. We can still do the tartibi tafsir, but avoid those pitfalls. Um, However, to avoid falling in the pitfall of preconceived notions of what a chapter is supposed to be, what it means for there to be a chapter. I think that's where that thought comes from. When humans write books, and these thoughts come from very organized minded people, people that have spent a lot of time in subjects that the order of discussion is very important, and they try to organize their thoughts a lot. And so uh, they try to create a system. They think the chapter has a system that we are used to, we are familiar with. For example, a chapter is supposed to have one or two or three subjects, and everything needs to be revolving around that, and somehow needs to be connected to that one or two or three chapters. Now, that's an assumption about how God made chapters. We don't know. He didn't say that's how I make chapters, just because when human beings write, uh, that's how some people do it, and that's not even all human beings. Uh, these people who are doing that tafsir assume that that's a better way of doing it, and so they've come up with this idea. Every chapter has one theme, a couple of subjects that are connected in that one theme, and then every story, every little thing is connected with that main theme in the chapter. Well, if the chapter doesn't tell you that very clearly, then you shouldn't assume that. If there is a chapter that has that, okay, but to assume every chapter is like that, you can't enter the chapter with that preconceived notion. You've got to go to the chapter, see what you understand, and see if that is there or not. Not already assume that it's there and look for it. You should not assume, we should not assume anything is there before we enter it. We should be a clean slate going, what do you have for me? When we are looking for answers to questions, and we should do that both individually and also collectively, we should have conversations, sessions, classes, whatever, and we should discuss a theme based tafsir or understanding of the Quran. Go with a question: what is God's instruction or teaching or guidance on a particular subject that we have, something we want to know what our guidance is? So go with that question, say, is there anything? And if there is, what is it? We should do that. We should have tartibi. But when we do the thematic, right, one of the things that can be a pitfall, and it is that we tend to look at other people and what they have uh, taken as verses relevant to that subject. Or even when we don't do that, when we go and try to just be open and pick out and select whatever verse that we remember may be relevant, we do a couple of searches with words or a few different words to find things that are relevant, find a thesaurus of some sort, and find words that are similar, or perhaps at some point AI is going to be useful in that and help us with our search in the Quran. But in the end, what we're going to do at that point is going to be referring to the verses that we have already understood to be one way or another relevant to that subject. There might be another verse that is relevant to that subject that we couldn't think of when we had that question, and it'll be entirely missed. And this is something I find very frequently in discussions that scholars have on a particular topic. There's only a couple of verses cited, no other verses cited, and at least I, for one, am able to find a few more verses that would shed light on that subject in a way that If you take those other verses that were initially used, you're not going to understand a complete thought from the Quran on the topic. So and there's no avoiding that. When you're going in with a question, you're going to go to whatever you find. You're going to search the best you can. So what we're saying is that there's room for a third way of trying to understand the Quran that avoids those shortcomings that we can have if we approach it in those two other methods. Because those two other methods are already available, scholars are already doing that. What I want to do here is neither of those. In an attempt to avoid the pitfalls of those two methods, and there might be a shortcoming with this method, that's why as many methods as we can think of, we should go and try to understand the Quran, different angles, different approaches, different ways, to try to reduce our shortcomings in understanding it and enable ourselves to take more and more from the Quran and filter out all the preconceived notions that many times we're not aware of. Again, now when we say there's preconceived notions, we're not saying someone deliberately, this is not tafsir bil ra'i, someone takes a preconceived notion and says the Quran says this, because their whole approach to understanding the Quran is to feed it what they think it should say. Uh, Sometimes that is done historically. That has been done. Currently, it is being done. The terrorist organizations that use the verses of the Quran to justify their crimes, that's exactly what they do. Anyone who in the religious community wants to take a faction of the believers and take them in the wrong direction has got no choice but to use the Quran. At least that's going to be something that will take most people in their direction, or they have a better chance of taking more people in the direction that they want. So they're going to be using the Quran. So when you go in, you don't care what the Quran says. You're looking for a verse that you can disguise as it's saying what you want it to say. That's tafsir bil ra'i. You already have a preconceived notion. You refer to the Quran and you want it to say what you want. So you find the right wording, like, oh, this verse is saying, see, I told you, the Quran says this. That's tafsir bil ra'i. We're not saying, al-ayadu billah, these great people who spent a lot of time trying to understand the Quran, going to the Quran and extracting meanings and expressing that to people, explaining that, putting that in books, that they had this preconceived notion. They wanted to say, oh, the Quran has a subject-based thing and what have you, all the things that we said earlier, all the examples we gave. No, these are things that happen subconsciously. These are things that happen without awareness. The person is not aware if they would be convinced, if this would be something that you could shed light on and clarify to them, look, you're not taking this from the Quran, you're bringing this from outside. If you can show it to them, they would definitely reject it and say, oh, I didn't realize. So that's an issue that we've got to work on. And so we're saying this third approach of taking verses that seem to be, or at random, not seem to be, they are random. We want to select a verse and just see what that verse says. One last thing I would say about this approach is, again, I need to explain a certain belief that exists that in tafsir that's very common, and it's been used relatively, at least frequently, in understanding or explaining verses to mean or to have a certain meaning. And we want to rebut here, and that is something called siyaq, okay, in Arabic. Siyaq means context. The English equivalent of that is context. Um, Context, right, is a word that is pretty clear in the definition of the word, but in terms of the application of the word, it is very vague and ambiguous. Okay. Let me give you a completely different example so we understand what the difference between the two is. When you say light, light is a very clear, has a very clear meaning. Okay, but what does it mean? Are you referring to the light that the Quran talks about, nuran tamshuna bihi? There's a light that you're able to walk with. Well, that's not the light that is currently making this video possible. This is lighting that you purchase for a few $100 a piece, and you have to set them up in the right angle, and whether they are LEDs or what have you, uh, the the power they take, the illumination that they cause, the warmth or the coolness, all of these things, sunlight. That's a different type of light we're talking about. The word is pretty clear. The application says set up a light. Someone who doesn't know lighting for videography is going to set up a light that is they think is going to be good because that's how they see. But then on the video, it's it's really poor. So when it comes to the meaning of the word, the definition of the word light, it's pretty clear. But when I say there's light here, or depending on the light, what exactly does that mean? If you listen to, again, I'm just throwing out examples to clarify an idea. When you listen to people who are talking about lighting for videography or for photography, uh, initially it's you think you got it. You go and purchase a couple. It's light. You go on Amazon or somewhere like, okay, let's start with something that costs a little less, a little more affordable, and you buy a couple of pieces. And you're like, okay, they said to put it this way, and then you make the video or take the photo, and like it's terrible. It is absolutely terrible. You thought you understood what they're talking about. The meanings of the words are pretty clear, but the application is this what they're talking about? Is the other light what they're talking about? It's not very clear. When you say context, sometimes, for example, they say, oh, you need to know the historic context. What is the historic context? Do we know what the historic context is? Do we have solid evidence of what the historic context is? Has the historic context been mentioned in a type of book or a type of reference that we can know for sure that it's right the way the Quran is? Or is the historic context related to us by narrations that may or may not be accurate? God knows when they were compiled, and just because they're in a tafsir book, to assume that they are valid, they are legitimate, not knowing the background of that book. Was that book compiled in the second, third, fourth, fifth century of the Hijri calendar? And what were their references? Not knowing that, do we know the historic context when this verse was revealed or not? Do we know that for sure? Is that a guess? Is that a possibility, a probability? The other thing which I initially intended to discuss regarding the context, and this for people who are a little more intelligent about taking the narrations that we have about the context with a grain of salt and saying, well, we're not sure if these narrations are actually accurate. What we are sure is that the Quran is accurate. So we're going to judge whether that narration is right or wrong based on what we understand from the Quran. People who have come to this high bar of understanding of the Quran, as opposed to the low bar of taking any narration, oh, this verse is talking about this or that verse is talking about that, without even looking at the meaning of the verse. When you elevate yourself, people who've elevated themselves to the point where they're looking at the text of the Quran and saying, look, this is for certain that it's from God, we know for sure, so let's pay attention to exactly what the words are saying very carefully. And if we can determine that, or when we can determine that, then we're going to, based on that, that's going to be our solid proof, and then see which narration matches to what degree with this set of wording. People who have reached that high bar, they tend to interpret sentences within a verse, or a sentence in a verse, or a verse within a batch of verses that they think are talking about the same thing, and simply because the other subjects that are there, they consider that to be a context in which this sentence or this verse or this word that is in the midst of that is related to that subject, unless proven otherwise. Now, it's going to take me a long time to give examples for all of those. I'll give you one example of maybe one of the ones that they have come up with. For example, in Surah Al-Ma'idah, the verse, I think it's verse number 3, if I remember correctly, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala initially starts talking about the types of things that are haram, a few elements, a few items that are haram. and then it says اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا اليوم يئس الذين كفروا. If I got the order right. So these few sentences and a little more that I couldn't remember the exact wording. I thought I remembered the exact wording on the ones that I did mention. Could be slightly off. I apologize. Again, this is to give a reference for those who want to check and see if that was verse number 3, in fact, or if I was wrong and that's not verse number 3. You have a few words. If some of them are wrong, some of them are perhaps, hopefully, you get at least one word right in there where you can search and find the verse. That's the objective of mentioning the Arabic of the verse for reference. I'm not claiming I'm not a hafiz. I don't have the entirety of the Quran memorized word for word. I refer to the text of it when I want to be accurate and precise in understanding it. So anyhow, in that verse, these scholars have been able to identify that while it's one verse, the beginning and the middle and the end are not talking about the same subject. That's clear. So they say, well, that's clear in the wording, so we're not going to assume that this is because it's in the midst of these words about this is the day that your religion has been completed. This is the day that the kuffar are now, they've lost hope in changing your religion or taking your religion away from you, or whatever the interpretation is going to be there. This part is not about those rulings regarding certain items being haram. Why? It's very evident. You cannot understand this wording in connection to that. If you understand this wording and the wording at the beginning of the verse and at the end of the verse, each of them by themselves, you will realize that these are not talking about the same subject. It's very evident. Okay. But there are times where it's not that evident, and that's where the problem arises. When you assume that if a sentence is in the midst of a few other sentences, then it's going to be relevant unless proven otherwise. That itself is an assumption. That's not something that God has stated. That's something that, based on those clear instances where we do have sentences that are mixed in, blended in with other sentences, and they are completely irrelevant, okay, completely to our mind. This is not to say that they're completely irrelevant. It doesn't, to us, it seems like it's irrelevant. All right. To our minds, the way we speak, it's irrelevant. That's one topic, that's one subject, that's about halal and haram and eating food. And this one is about the religion, it's about walaya, it's about ghadir, and so on and so forth. The very fact that we have those verses, and it's not one or two, tells us that that's not God's style to necessarily say something, a few sentences, a few verses, only about a particular subject. In the midst of a verse and a sentence, there could be, or a series of sentences. Not, I can't think of an instance of in the middle of one sentence, another sentence being there that's irrelevant. I don't know if I can say that's even possible. I don't know, but I don't want to claim that I've seen that. What is clear is that because the Quran doesn't have paragraphs. Okay, it's not poetry, and it's not the way we write literary works of other forms. It's God's style. It's got similarity to poetry. In poetry, we do have poets in their various verses talking about different things. Sometimes we can see a connection. Sometimes I don't think the poet can see a connection between those things. It's important to them. It's on their mind. There's probably some connection there, or there might be some connection there, but it's not like a book on philosophy, or a book on, I don't know, science, where each paragraph it's structured in a way to get you from point A to point B, and everything is relevant to the same topic. It's poetry. It's different. It's got some resemblance to poetry, but otherwise it's not poetry. It doesn't have what Arab poetry has. It's not like other forms of poetry. It's beautiful. It has beauty. Sometimes it seems like it rhymes, but that's not something that is consistent. Okay, so it's got resemblance to poetry, but it's not poetry. So anyhow, we cannot assume that a sentence being amidst sentences related to a certain topic automatically makes that sentence related to that topic. There's got to be words, pronouns, somehow referring to something in that general topic that is going to uh, clarify to us that this is on the same topic that the previous sentence and sentences perhaps have been. All right. We cannot, again, the main point here is, and everything else is an example of, we need to make sure we do not assume the verses are doing something or saying something or in a certain way without they themselves telling us that. Just because we usually do something, write something in a certain way, or that person who, or I who am trying to understand the Quran, write in a particular way, that's going to be the way that God has put this thing together. No. We've got to go to the exact wording of it with very basic tools. Again, I will repeat, the only tool required to understand the Quran is the Arabic language, period. There is nothing else there that can help us understand the Quran. Everything else is going to be an obstacle in understanding the Quran. That includes narrations that talk about the historic context of the verse. That includes narrations that are attributed to the Prophet or the Ahlul Bayt that suggest the verse is about something. All of those are going to be obstacles. We are not sure any of those narrations are accurate. We are not sure if the Ma'sum has said that wording in that particular way. If they did, to whom they said that, what they intended. We don't know any of that. What we do know is that the Quran was revealed by God for all mankind, including me. So let me clarify what the verse means, or the verses mean, by themselves, and then I can go to those narrations if I see that it conforms with that meaning of the Quran, or if I find that based on that narration, I realize it points to something that when I go back to the verse, I see that that narration is accurate, and that narration helped me understand the Quran better. And that's a sign that that narration is accurate. But again, it's a process of understanding the Quran independently, going to a narration, and then coming, if I see that it says something different, coming back to the Quran and seeing for myself again, is it the case that I misunderstood and this narration helps me correct my understanding? Do I see what that narration is telling me the verse has in it, or the more I look, no, it's the opposite of what the verse is saying, or it's alien to the verse. It has nothing to the to do with the verse. So with the that tool of classical Arabic, we've got to refer to the Quran, remove all preconceived notions from our minds, and see what the verses say, and take that and start building our understanding of the Quran. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen.